Before we begin, I want to thank The Ridge for sponsoring this video. I'm pretty picky about what sponsors I would allow on this channel, because I don't want to endorse something that I wouldn't use myself. The wallets made by The Ridge are a phenomenal alternative to the more traditional bulky wallets that are quite literally a pain in the backside. While that alone is a compelling argument, I personally like the Ridge wallets because of the slim design, high quality material, and ability to clip onto a pocket. This allows me to not worry about it falling on the ground somewhere when I'm off hiking in the mountains. Right now you can get 10% off your very own Ridge wallet by clicking the link in the description and using the coupon code MISSINGENIGMA at checkout. On Sunday, August 8th of 1897, 6-year-old Lillian Carney went with her parents to pick blueberries on the Mullen Bog, west of the Aroostook River near Masardis, Maine. At around noon that day, Lillian somehow strayed away from her parents. Once they noticed their daughter was missing, they began searching, but after a while they realized they needed more help and left to recruit additional manpower. Searchers poured into the area and kept looking until midnight. Early the next morning, more than 200 men did a careful search for miles around the location Lillian disappeared. They found nothing but stayed throughout the night searching the woods. By the third day, more than 300 men had now come to the area to perform another careful search. At around 10 a.m., a man named Bert Pollard discovered Lillian wandering the forest about 2 or 3 miles from the place that she started. She seemed perfectly calm and serene, and told the searcher that she was looking for her mother. In her hand, she carried some wild berries, but did not eat them, she said, because she was afraid they might be bad for her. She then made the statement that has raised a lot of questions about this case. Lillian claimed that the sun shined all the time in the woods, although she was missing for 2 nights. The newspaper reporting on this story attempts to explain this anomaly by stating the moon shone brightly for some of the nights, presuming the 6-year-old Lillian had confused the moon with the sun. Lillian would go on to say that she had heard people talking the day before, but decided to keep still and not show herself because she thought they were tramps. And she saw some little things that were about as big as her cat, and when she clapped at them, they ran away. The article writer presumed these to be rabbits that lived in the area. Lillian was returned safely to her parents, and there were no reports that she suffered any ill effects from being lost in the wilderness for 2 days and nights. This disappearance is a popular case that a number of people requested me to cover. The entire strangeness of this incident essentially lies in the single statement made by Lillian that the sun shined all the time while she was in the woods, and it certainly is an unusual statement. I think the newspaper's explanation that Lillian was confusing the sun with the moon when night fell to be a little far-fetched, as most 6-year-olds are probably aware of the difference between the two, having seen both for the entirety of her young life. Typically, such statements can usually be explained away by saying the child was delirious and suffering from exposure. But the article makes it pretty clear that Lillian was very calm and aware when she was found, and had no trouble explaining all of the other things that happened to her while she was missing. This certainly makes this case an unusual one. As a side note, anyone attempting to research this case online may come across a website claiming that in 1986, a man named John Poland, supposedly the great-grandson of Bert Poland, the man who discovered Lillian in 1897, shared a note from his great-grandfather that was written the night after he found her. The supposed note said that when found, Lillian was wearing a cape of fur and a crown of flowers, and that she kept talking about the hairy people with sunlight in their eyes, and that Bert spent the rest of his days wandering the woods searching for these hairy people. The claims on this website are entirely fake. Not only is there no source citation for any of the information contained on the page, but they didn't even get the names right, as the man who found Lillian Carney was actually named Bert Pollard, not Bert Poland. I am pointing this out because I have seen people take this information as a form of fact, but there is no information out there anywhere that supports any of this. The Lillian Carney case is interesting enough in its own right, without needing to add any sort of Sasquatch angle to muddy the waters. On June 4th of 1899, Hermann Eschholz, a recent widower, took his 5 children out to picnic in an area called Dewar's Mountain Grove on the outskirts of New Britain. Annie was Herman's 5-year-old daughter, and the family was preparing to spend their Sunday among many others, relaxing at this resort area. During the afternoon, all the children went to a soda stand, and when it came to Annie's turn to be served, she was nowhere to be found. The children immediately notified their father, who was dumbfounded as he had seen his daughter only minutes before she suddenly vanished. Over 100 people were in the area, and not one had seen what had happened to Mr. Eschholz's daughter. A small search party was immediately formed using the help of other families picnicking in the area. The woods and bushes surrounding the area were thoroughly searched, but to no avail. At this point, Hermann Eschholz drove to New Britain, where he notified police of his daughter's disappearance. Mr. Eschholz returned to the grove to continue searching for his daughter with the help of officials. A nearby gypsy camp in the area came under immediate suspicion and was searched by police until they were satisfied Annie was not there. Attention then turned to a nearby pond where it was thought that Annie had perhaps fallen in and drowned. The pond was dragged, but still nothing was found. The woods continued to be searched by multiple different groups, each covering virtually the same areas until officials felt certain that the girl was no longer in the area. A little girl came forward and told police that she had seen a man who worked for Mr. Eschholz carry Annie away on a bicycle. Hartford detectives followed up this lead and questioned the man until they were convinced he had nothing to do with Annie's disappearance. The police still believed that someone must have kidnapped little Annie, since searches in the area were still turning up nothing, and the dense brush and swampland in the area would prevent any child from traveling very far. Police fanned out, knocking on doors of any nearby farmhouses to check and see if anyone had seen the abduction of Annie. On the 3rd day, a local man named Albert Voigt took the day off from work to assist in the search. He had hunted the area many times and was very familiar with the landscape. Voigt was searching some 2 miles southeast of the grove when he spied Annie Eschholz lying face down near a tree. She was conscious, but blood was flowing from her nose. Annie's toes were poking out of her torn shoes, and she had some green strawberries held tightly in her hand. She was able to get up and stagger towards Voigt upon seeing him. Voigt then picked the girl up and carried her through the dense forest until he reached the Dewar Hotel. Word was immediately sent for a physician as well as the child's father. The doctor found that Annie had a fever and a swollen tongue, as well as being in a generally weak condition. She was very uncommunicative and usually answered questions with a simple nod. However, she was able to answer the question of where she had been. When asked, she cryptically responded that, "I slept in the woods and the moon looked at me." When asked if anyone had taken her away, she said no. She communicated that she had eaten and drank little while she was lost. Though she was now home safe and sound, many mysteries still remained that puzzled officials. Albert Voigt had discovered Annie in an area that had already been searched many times before. Her shoes also showed evidence that she had done a lot of walking, yet her clothing did not show the wear that would have been expected from wandering around the thick brush. To get to the location where she was found, Annie would have also had to crawl through a barbed wire fence, but her clothes were not torn. A New Britain constable who was most active in the search for Annie still believed that she was kidnapped, as he himself had walked over the ground where the child would later have been found. Mr. Eschholz felt similarly that the nearby gypsies were somehow involved in the disappearance of his daughter, as the group had up and left right after Annie was found. Regardless, there was no evidence directly implicating them. The disappearance of Annie Eschholz parallels many others. specifically the unexplained nature of her being found in a location that had already been searched, as well as the condition of her clothing compared to the condition of her shoes. Her odd explanation of where she had been could be written off as the delirious ramblings of a child suffering from exposure, but this response is also somewhat reminiscent of Lillian Carney's, with both children speaking of strange astronomical phenomena. The police and Mr. Eschholz's belief that gypsies were somehow responsible for kidnapping Annie seems more like a convenient scapegoat than anything else. This was a time period when it was easy for law enforcement to blame many crimes on gypsy people. This excuse likely was born out of a desire to try and explain some of the more unusual findings that arose in this case. Three-year-old Louis Dunton lived with his family in Bennington, Vermont. Louis was one of 12 children in the Dunton household, and on October 9, 1947, as the family lined up for dinner, it was noticed that Louis was missing. Louis's parents took time to search for their son before going to the authorities for assistance. 75 volunteers showed up to scour the woods looking for Louis, and at about 7 hours into the search, Sheriff Arthur Jennison told all the volunteers to exit the area so he could attempt to use a bloodhound named Queenie that he had recently purchased to hunt humans. The search would be the dog's first test. The sheriff, who was reportedly a bit of a camera enthusiast, must have expected something exciting to happen, so he had a local newspaper photographer come along with them. Queenie was given Louis's scent using a pair of his shoes, and the bloodhound began searching the forest. In little more than an hour, Queenie led the group through a swamp and thick woodland to the exact location of Louis Dunton, who was found sitting quietly in a pile of brush, stark naked. This case is one of a kind in the sense that Louis's picture was taken by the photographer in almost the exact moment Queenie the bloodhound discovered him, shining their flashlights on the wide-eyed and frightened child. Louis suffered no ill effects after being lost for almost 8 hours, and he told the searchers that he had gone blueberry hunting. Louis's clothing was found laying nearby. The question still remains, however, why would this 3-year-old child remove his clothing, especially as temperatures began to plummet? Sheriff Jennison gave his opinion on the matter by saying, "The only theory I have is that when it got dark, he thought it was time to go to bed, so he took his clothes off." The newspapers reported that Louis just smiled whenever they tried to pry information out of him, and that to him, it all seemed like a big joke. "22-month-old Emma Clabaugh lived with her parents and older sister in the mountains between Sibyllsville and Emmitsburg, Maryland. On July 1st, Mr. Claibou left their home to travel to a nearby neighbor's house in order to get butter for the family dinner. Emma, as well as her 4-year-old sister Bertha, wanted to go along but were told to stay put. The father left his children sitting on their front porch playing while their mother was in the house peeling potatoes. At some point, Bertha decided to walk down the road to greet her father as he returned from the neighbors. Emma followed her sister in this endeavor until the two came to a fence that only Bertha was big enough to cross. The two separated at this point, leaving little Emma alone at the fence line. Mr. Claibou came upon Bertha as he returned home, and when he greeted his wife, he asked where Emma was. Nobody knew what had happened to her. The family immediately began searching for her. Mr. Claibou informed his neighbors of the incident, and as word spread, more and more searchers flooded into the area. Up to 200 men were scouring the forest looking for a baby that could not have traveled very far. The men had no luck finding any evidence, and it wasn't long before kidnapping became the prevailing theory in the case. Mr. Claibou became so desperate to find his daughter that he traveled to Gettysburg, Maryland, where he met an African-American necromancer, or sorceress as some newspapers called her, who went by the name Black Mag. This necromancer told Mr. Claibou that his daughter had indeed been kidnapped by a woman with a similar description to that of a Mrs. Henry Miller, a local family with whom the Claibous had feuded. A group of a few hundred men showed up at the Miller house and searched it thoroughly, but to no avail. Mr. Miller vehemently denied any involvement in the disappearance of Claibou's daughter. Over 2 weeks passed without any new developments, until a group of people picking huckleberries over a mile away from the Claibou home noticed a number of buzzards hovering around a mountainous area known as Sheep's Rock. The group investigated and came upon a horrifying discovery. They found Emma Clabaugh deceased. Her head was found 16 feet from the rest of her body, and the bones of the body were stripped clean of flesh with the exception of the feet and a hand. The feet were described as being perfectly preserved despite the fact that the soles showed significant bruising and scratches. An inquest was held in an attempt to determine the cause of death. Ultimately, they were unable to do so, and it was assumed that the child must have perished from exposure and been left to animal predation. However, the location of the body stumped the inquest. Emma was found in an area that had already been searched many times before. Not only this, but the area where the body was found was described as being extremely difficult for a grown man to get to, much less a small child. A newspaper described it as such. The whole way is through a rocky and closely grown wood, the ascent of the mountain being very steep, almost too much for even a man to have ascended it in a short space of time that was consumed by the child. A doctor and nun who was present for the inquest testified that it would have been a physical impossibility for the child to have reached the spot alive had she not gone on without stopping, and it was also impossible for a girl of 22 months to walk the distance without dropping down by the way, exhausted. I think the concerns raised at the inquest are valid. Like a number of other cases, the child was found in a location that had been thoroughly searched before. It is likely that this young child did not last long before perishing due to the elements. Presumably, this would mean her body should have been there when the searchers spent weeks combing the area. The way the doctor described the impossibility of the child being able to get to the location alive speaks volumes to the unexplained nature of the case. Was this a case of kidnapping, and the child's body was placed in this location after mounting search pressure? Or did something else happen to this unfortunate child? Until next time, thanks for watching.